Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Sarah Shasia. I am going to facilitate this webinar today. I will just wait perhaps a couple more minutes for people to join us. We have 61 people who registered for this webinar, and we had about 15 who have joined us right now. So we're just going to allow for people to trickle in, and then we will begin shortly. Thank you. Hello again, everyone. Thank you for standing by. So welcome to today's webinar, The Settlement Plan, Sponsor and Service Provider Perspectives. My name is Sarah Shasia. I'm a project coordinator at OCASI, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, and I'm your facilitator today. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few technical details with you to make sure that we make the most out of your participation in today's webinar. You should see something like this on your own desktop in the upper right corner. It's really your control panel. All participants are muted until the discussion period to minimize background noise during the presentation. So, but still, we want to encourage active participation from everyone during the discussion period. So once the presentations are done, we open the floor for questions and answers. And at that time, you can choose to type your questions here to me in a chat box, or use the hand icon here on your control panel so that I can unmute you for you to ask your question or make a comment directly. So there are really two ways to participate. If you type your question, what I will do is I'll read it out loud for everyone, including the presenters, and they will take a moment to respond to your question. But because this is also a best practice sharing type of webinar, it doesn't even have to be a question, it can also be a comment. So if you have a comment or addition to make to the topic discussed today, feel free to do that as well. Just make sure, please, that your questions and comments are on the topic and that they're relevant to as many listeners as possible. So we'd like to thank you for that. Also, please note that we're recording today's webinar, and we'll be posting that recording online, especially for those that can't make it at this time or on this day. And a copy of today's presentation slides from our presenters will also be posted there. The link will be shared with you in a follow-up email that you get in about 2 days. So this webinar is part of OCASI's Refugee Settlement Support Projects, Sharing Practices to Build Bridges webinar series. And this series really aims to clarify roles and responsibilities, increase transparency, and strengthen collaboration between refugee sponsors and service providers. The idea for it and the topics that we're covering came from focus groups and roundtable discussions that we've held over the past year with many of service providers and sponsors across Ontario. So today's webinar is the fourth in that series, and as I mentioned, you can watch previous webinar recordings on our website, and the link you should be able to see here. Actually, the first link is the schedule for the next upcoming webinars. You would go to welcomeontario.ca, click on updates, and then click on sharing practices to build bridges, upcoming OCASI webinars. But previous webinars you can also see on Welcome Ontario under the past webinars tab, or on our wiki site, which is wiki.settlement.org. You would go to refugees and then Refugee Settlement Support Project. But again, these two links will be sent to you in a follow-up email as well. So today's topic, Settlement Plan, Sponsoring Service Provider Perspectives, it's really focusing on the settlement plan or planning aspect of this type of work. So both refugee sponsorship groups and service providers tend to work with some kind of settlement plan. Now, I know we talk about the settlement plan, but these may look different, and our presenters will tell you more about that today. So to tell us more about that and we get started with the different approaches to developing a settlement action plan, we're joined today by Suneet Kharay. He's a national trainer with the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program, and Christina Chu, who is a settlement worker at the Catholic Cross Cultural Services in Toronto, in East Toronto. Before I hand it over to them, they have 3 documents for you that you can see also on your menu, on your control panel under the handout tab. One is a responsibility a document laying out the responsibilities of sponsorship groups and service providers prepared by the federal government under the IRCC department, and the other one is the actual settlement plan form that Suneet will talk about a little bit more. So you can see that and click on it to download them onto your computer. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over and welcome Suneet and Christina to begin with their presentations. So welcome, Christina and Suneet. I am just going to, make them presenters. Here we go.
Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. My name is Suneet, and I am a trainer at the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. And RSTP is based at Catholic Cross Cultural Services, and I'm here with one of my colleagues, Christina, who is a settlement worker at Catholic Cross Cultural Services.
Hello.
So in terms of the agenda for today, we're going to be looking at the settlement plan from two perspectives. The first, which I will be covering, is the refugee sponsorship perspective, and the second perspective will be that of the settlement agency or the settlement worker, just to see and draw comparisons between the two and see where there is overlap between the two settlement plans, which will hopefully lead to both parties, both refugee sponsors and settlement agencies and settlement workers working closely together to facilitate the settlement of the sponsored refugee. So I'm just going to start with a very brief recap of the two main refugee sponsorship programs where private sponsors are involved in the settlement and support of the refugee. Some of you may be aware of these already. This may have been covered previously in depth in past webinars, but I'm just going to cover it very quickly just to give some context to the discussion today. So starting off with the Private Sponsorship of Refugees program, or the PSR program for short. This is a program where private sponsoring groups can sponsor refugees for resettlement to Canada. And it's a 12-month sponsorship program, so the private sponsoring group is responsible for providing settlement and financial support to the refugees that they've applied to sponsor for the first 12 months after arrival. And the second program where private sponsors are involved is the Blended Visa Office Referred Program, or the BVOR program for short. The BVOR program is a cost-sharing program between the federal government and private sponsors. So the federal government will provide 6 months of financial support, and the private sponsoring group will provide 6 months of financial support plus the initial startup costs associated with settlement, and they're also responsible for providing 12 months of settlement support to the refugees that they've sponsored. So just to draw some, if you are assisting refugees that do come and approach you for assistance, and they mention that they have a sponsoring group, just be aware that they may have been sponsored under the BVOR program or the PSR program, and some of the financial responsibilities differ between the two. And in terms of financial responsibilities for sponsors, so IRCC has created the sponsorship cost table, and this was recently updated in March of this year, and will most likely again be updated at some point in 2018. And what the sponsorship cost table is, it outlines the minimum level of financial support that sponsoring groups need to provide to the sponsored refugee based on family size. So for example, if you were sponsoring one individual, your group would need to provide a minimum of $13,500 to the refugee you're sponsoring if you're sponsoring under the PSR program. If it's under the BVOR program, you take this figure in the 12 months of income support for a person of one, which is $10,700, and you divide it by 2. So your group will be responsible for providing $5,350 of income support. The remaining $5,350 will come from the federal government, and your group is also responsible for providing $2,800 in startup costs. Now, some sponsoring groups, that they do have certain resources available to them. They may have shelter, clothing, furniture, startup costs, or food staples available to them at the time they submit the application. So there's not necessarily the need for them to provide the stipulated financial support based on family size in the cost table. So for example, with me and my sponsoring group, we were sponsoring one individual. According to the cost table, the minimum amount that we need to provide is $13,500 under the PSR program. But we have shelter, clothing, furniture, food staples, and startup costs available to us already. So we don't need to provide the refugee that we're sponsoring with money for those things. So we can make these deductions using these figures in the in-kind deduction table from the total cost of set or financial support in the cost table, which will reduce our financial commitment and the money that we need to provide to the government. So just be aware, depending on what program the refugees are coming under, depending on whether there's in-kind deductions being done, not every refugee being sponsored to Canada will be receiving the same level of financial support from the sponsoring group that has sponsored them for resettlement to Canada. When it comes to settlement responsibilities, these are the same across the board for both PSR and BVOR cases. So just a quick overview, sponsors have to welcome the refugees at the airport. They have to help orientate and integrate them to life in Canada. They have to provide the refugees with temporary accommodation if permanent accommodation isn't readily available, assist the refugees with finding permanent accommodation or have that secured already for arrival, apply for the interim federal health program if it wasn't provided to them at the airport on arrival, apply for the Ontario healthcare program or provincial healthcare if it's in another province, find a family doctor, a dentist, and any other health services, enroll the children in school, apply for the Canada Child Tax Benefit and assist them with filing their tax return, enroll them in English or French classes, assist them with applying for a social insurance number if it's, again, not given to them at the airport, promote and help them with finding employment and self-employment, open up a bank account for them, connect them with a settlement agency, which is one of the very core elements of this webinar series, and why OCASI is doing this webinar series is because IRCC is expecting private sponsoring groups, be it under the PSR program or the BVOR program, to connect with their local settlement agency to help them facilitate the refugees' settlement in Canada. And finally, providing emotional and moral support. So in terms of where all these settlement responsibilities come from and how sponsors demonstrate the level of financial support they're committing to when submitting the application, the origin of all of these responsibilities is the settlement plan. So on screen at the moment, I have the settlement plan that is completed by groups of 5 engaging in sponsorship. And the settlement plan differs depending on the type of sponsoring group. So it may be a sponsorship agreement holder, it may be a group of 5, or it may be a community sponsor. And the settlement plan varies slightly between the 3 groups, but the general essence and the core principles of the settlement plan are the same. The settlement plan that is available for you to download is the settlement plan that's completed by groups working or individuals working with sponsorship agreement holders, and it looks slightly different to this one. So this is page 1 of the settlement plan, and on page 1, groups of 5 need to provide a breakdown of where the monetary support that they will be providing will be allocated to. So how much money have they allocated to clothing, furniture, household startup costs, food staples, hookup costs, school startup costs, shelter, transportation, and living allowance. And the sponsoring group also use this table to indicate where and how they're doing in-kind deductions if they are doing so. So when a sponsoring group is completing this settlement plan, if they're providing monetary support, they will tick the monetary support box and they would provide the amount that they're providing for clothing, for example. If they're doing in-kind deductions, they would go to the in-kind deduction table, see what they can deduct for clothing, and then tick the in-kind deduction box and provide that figure in the in-kind deduction table. So when this application is submitted to IRCC, what they will look at is to see whether the grand total of monetary support plus in-kind deductions is equal to or greater than the figure in the sponsorship cost table based on family size. So this is how a group of 5 would demonstrate that they have the necessary finances and the necessary financial capacity to support the refugee that they're applying to sponsor. So if you are working with a refugee that was sponsored under the PSR or the BVOR program, do try and get a hold of the settlement plan. So ask the sponsoring group, would you be willing to share a copy of the settlement plan with me, just so I can have an idea of the level of financial support that you committed to providing when you initially submitted the application to IRCC. On page 2 of this settlement plan, the group of 5 has to provide detail and information relating to the accommodation they plan on securing or providing to the refugee they're sponsoring, including very specific information on the type of property it is. Is it a house? Is it a condo? Is it an apartment? Is it a basement apartment? Like how many rooms or bathrooms will be made available to the refugee if anybody's living in the property already? If so, how many people? Who owns the property? The address? And IRCC has already been looking into the group of 5 settlement plan and the settlement plan for other groups when it does come to accommodation, to see if groups have made adequate arrangements for the refugees on arrival, or if they have an appropriate plan in place for when the refugee does arrive to house them in proper accommodation. On the second question, the group of 5 needs to, again, specify what settlement agencies are in the local area and how will the group of 5 be using the services offered by these settlement agencies to assist them with fulfilling their settlement responsibilities. So IRCC is expecting groups, when they do submit the application, to do their research, figure out what settlement agencies are available, what services they provide, and how those services available at the settlement agency will be able to assist them and the refugee that they've sponsored with facilitating the refugee's integration and settlement in Canada. And the final question relates to mental health issues. So if there are any mental health issues that need to be addressed, IRCC would like to know that the group has a plan in place, they've done their research, they know what mental health services are available in the local area and how they plan on connecting the refugee that they've sponsored with those available services. On the final page, the group needs to outline how the financial support is being provided. So this is specifically for a group of 5. So a group of 5 we need to demonstrate, is the money being held in a bank account, or are people committing the money from their income once the refugee arrives in Canada? And then on the right-hand side over here, this is for IRCC to complete. So they will go to the sponsorship cost table to see what the total cost of sponsorship is for the family size that's being sponsored. So for example, it's a family of 1, it would be 13,500 so for example, it would be 13,500. IRCC will then look to see what amount of in-kind deductions are being provided. So say, for example, the group's doing 3,500 in in-kind deductions, and they will then figure out the final cost of sponsorship by subtracting the total in-kind deduction from the total cost of sponsorship, so it comes down to $10,000. And they will then look to see on the left-hand side over here, does the group or has the group demonstrated that they have the capacity by either placing money in the bank account or having at least 3 people employed or self-employed to provide this $10,000 to the refugee that they're sponsoring. Now, like I mentioned, it looks slightly different for community sponsors and sponsorship agreement holders, but the core essence and principles of the settlement plan are the same. The thing to note is if you do come across a refugee that's being sponsored by a sponsorship agreement holder or a group or a individual partnering with a sponsorship agreement holder, if the organization has been a sponsorship agreement holder for longer than 2 years, there's no need for them to submit a settlement plan, although they should keep it on file for their internal records. So this is just a very brief overview of what a settlement plan looks like for a group of 5 and the origin and source of the sponsoring group's financial and settlement responsibilities. So I'm now going to pass on to Christina, and she's going to be speaking about the settlement plan that's produced and completed by settlement agencies.
Okay, with settlement workers, there are many of us in different organizations. The kind of settlement plan the settlement workers prepare are done after meeting with newcomers, assessing their needs and work out the plan together with them. So that means that in most cases, the clients, the newcomers are already in Canada. We don't have a cost table per se, but what we do is look at captions. Okay, the scope of work we do, each settlement worker sees a few hundred clients a year. We see requests such as how do I get a license in Ontario? Or how do I apply for child benefit? How can I, or there's a miscommunication with CRA or Ontario Works, what should I do? How do I become a trade person again in Canada? I'm being mistreated by my employer, what could I do? Or I just landed in Canada, I want to understand the different benefits for my family. So these are some of the questions, by no means a complete list, but it gives you some idea about the scope of work that we do. On the settlement plan, there will be activities stated in there. Usually the settlement, our purpose is to look at, what are the needs and then do the work. For example, in the case of if we are working with a refugee sponsor, we will look at what they could do, but we certainly have limitation. For example, more likely than not, we are not at the airport welcoming the newly landed refugees. On the other hand, settlement workers are ready to assist children needing to enroll in schools, whether to explain the requirements for enrollment or help when the educational documents from home countries were lost. Other activities in the settlement plan could be that settlement workers could research the financial assistance that could be available in the local area and assist with the application. Some government or community services have long waiting lists. Settlement workers will know what services would be available upon newcomers' arrival and ways to reach the requirements for services faster. The best time to involve a settlement worker is early in the application process. Some of the problems could be anticipated and resolved ahead of time. A coworker was telling me that the sponsor approached them stating that the refugee family, especially the father, has illness that required attention. So they did solve that problem ahead of time so that there is no interruption in the treatment. We talk about health issues, but settlement agency would know the availability of some crucial resources, especially those related to health. For example, in our organization, we have a crisis counselor to help with mental health issues and family crisis. Now, I have a final message. Why do sponsors and settlement workers need to work together? That's to bring forth better solutions and possibly faster integration into Canadian society for the sponsor refugees. And also integrating sponsor refugees in the Canadian society is the shared responsibility between the sponsors and the settlement workers. Now, we have attached the RSTP document on the roles of the sponsor and settlement worker, so you can take a look at that later. Settlement workers could be instrumental in handling disputes that could be caused by linguistic and cultural differences. Now, why do we need to work early on in the settlement planning? That is to allow for a more comprehensive planning. and let us use our expertise and knowledge to help the whole plan to be done. Now, I don't have here listed a settlement plan, but if you go into this link, you will see resources in here related to what an action plan looks like, what a checklist looks like in terms of settlement duties. So that's my presentation. I'm open to questions.
And we'll just put our contact details on screen. If anybody has any questions after the webinar, either relating to settlement plans that settlement workers develop or anything relating to refugee sponsorship, you're welcome to contact us after the webinar.
Thank you, Suneet, and thank you, Christina, for your very informative and concise presentations. We still have quite a lot of time, which is great, for questions and conversations and discussions. So those who have joined us today, please feel free to type your questions, as I said earlier, or comments, or use the hand icon so that I can unmute you so that you can ask your questions directly. We're also interested in hearing what some of your practices look like if you are settlement workers. How do you sit together with the newcomer to develop or put together the settlement plan? Do you work with sponsors, if there are any? And if so, what does that look like? We're interested to hear from one another so we can learn and get inspired as well from one another. So yeah, we have about half an hour still for that. And perhaps as some people are typing the questions, Christina can ask you something that came up in one of the registrants' registration form as a question, which was basically, in terms of follow-up, if you were to see a client on average, how many times do you meet with them to fulfill the goals of the settlement plan? And I know you sort of alluded to that already, but if you do a needs assessment for a client, on average, how long do you work with them?
It depends on the situation. For example, these days I'm working with someone who needs to get a trades credential, tradesperson credential. Because of that, there's a language requirement. There's also the requirements by the Ontario College of Trade. And then, of course, they have the training guideline there. So it will involve months and sometimes be longer, depending on the speed the person required to increase the English. Sometimes individuals get a job, and as a result, they could not put that much time on just studying for the exam that Ontario College of Trade would require. So it really depends on the individual who, what kind of work they want to do, or what kind of needs they have. So it depends.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Karen, and it pertains to the slides. If you could perhaps go back, she said the website URL that's provided on your second last page of Christina's presentation doesn't seem to be correct. It is producing an error message. Can you please double check it, is what Karen is asking. Is it this one, Karen? Is it the My Orientation? Feel free, Suneet or Christina, to perhaps pull it up on your desktop, then we can also see it. This is it, right?
Yeah.
It's the orientation to...
You will need to register, need to get a username, register for, provide an email address, get a password before you could actually use the full, for example, you see the My Plans, My Checklist, etc.
Mm-hmm. And this is for service providers mainly?
This is actually can be for, they are for individuals. New in Canada. But what happened is that the kind of plan is, the checklist is no different because they are all related to settlement. Our role as settlement agencies is looking at that plan to see if the individuals wanted more assistance. As I mentioned earlier, in that example, the person wants to get back to the trade that he was in. So as a result, the plan will be different from someone who wants to study, for example, university, mm-hmm. or a person wants to get a job right away.
Right, thank you. Did that answer your question, Karen, I hope? Okay, great. Thank you. Christina, in your experience, do you when you have clients, or if you have clients or your colleagues have clients who are privately sponsored, do you sit together to review their settlement plan?
At this stage, a lot of the sponsors, they came when the refugees arrived. But I think that we need to look at doing the work before they arrive. My colleague did work with individuals, sponsors who have issues related to refugee family having illnesses. And as a result, the pre-arrival planning and also the planning during the stage of the application is important. And it is shown that it is helpful because it does not allow interruption in treatment.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Linda. Linda's asking about housing options. So how can we provide more options? How can we provide more options related to housing? And I guess this question, if you can tie it to the settlement plan, would be good.
Some of the successes related to housing, for example, groups are looking at, first of all, they look at themselves. And some of them use the social media to try to get support in that area. Some individuals belong to a church group, and they will ask the church members to see if there are individuals who have expertise or know about availability of lodgings. Because it is 1 year's obligation or responsibility, it requires a lot of thinking, because this will be the biggest piece of expense the sponsor would have to undertake. If all fail, of course, I have seen sponsor going to the marketplace and trying to negotiate better rent. There, even in Toronto, there are pockets of places have cheaper rent, but it requires some doing. That's for the short term. Long term, there's of course subsidized housing, but that will be after 13 months.
Thank you, Christina. We have a question from Lawrence. Lawrence had asked whether you could comment on the composition of a successful settlement plan. So I guess I'm not sure if this is relating to the sponsor settlement plan, but perhaps Suneet, if you could comment on what makes a settlement plan based on the form that you've shown us successful. You know, what are some of the components that would make that successful? So the question was, they're interested in learning more about the composition of a successful settlement plan.
So in terms of a successful settlement plan, there's really two angles you have to look at it from. The first angle would be the IRCC perspective. So what do they need when you initially submit the application from the sponsoring group in order to pass the hurdle of having the application approved? So that would be the first angle. And then the second angle would be the implementation of that settlement plan post-arrival once the refugee is in Canada. So just from the first perspective, what IRCC is looking for is that the sponsoring group have really looked into and thought out what are the specific needs of the refugees or the refugee family they're sponsoring, and what services and what assistance they can provide, and what adequate housing and accommodation they can provide to the refugees that best meet those needs. So what some sponsors do, they get a generic settlement plan either from the internet or from a immigration lawyer or an immigration consultant, and it's a very generic, broad settlement plan that doesn't take into consideration the specific needs of the refugee family that's being sponsored. Because each refugee that's coming to Canada has different settlement needs. You have people on a broad spectrum. You have people that are well educated, that are used to dealing with modern banking systems, technology, etc. You have people coming from urban environments, so urban refugees that are used to living in big cities. And you have refugees coming from more rural backgrounds who perhaps are more familiar with farming and not familiar with technology, or the level of education may be lower. So each refugee coming to Canada has its own settlement needs, and you really need to satisfy IRCC that the group has really thought and taken into account the specific needs of this family or of this refugee. And as much information as possible and as much detail as possible on the settlement plan. So I'm just going to go back to the settlement plan here. So if you look here, you can probably fit in 7 or 8 lines of text in each of these boxes. And what some sponsors have started doing is, because this isn't enough and because they've really thought through their settlement plan, they just write "please see attached" in these boxes, and then they have a 5 or 6 page document, a Word document that they attach to the form that really shows that they thought about everything from every angle. So they typically have go-to people for transportation, housing, schooling, English language classes. Is typically designated representatives for each of these categories, and very specific details and information on what's being done. So that's from what you need to do to satisfy IRCC and have a successful application approved. In terms of implementation, again, having a detailed, structured plan when you initially submit it will facilitate with implementation of that plan. So as well as outlining exactly what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, you would need to specify when you're going to do it. So what are the things you're going to do by the end of month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4, and because you have those hard deadlines, you as a group are forced to work towards meeting those deadlines and ensuring those settlement responsibilities are fulfilled. So that's really it from the refugee sponsorship perspective. I'm not sure if Christina has, from the settlement agency perspective.
With the when the individuals arrive, or before the refugees arrive, I think part of the success is that to see that your plan is realized. There will be problems along the way, but however, I think that the whole idea is having a group is that we can use each other's expertise to solve the problems. So those are the and also, of course, ultimately all parties concerned, the sponsors, the refugees, their health of all parties concerned would have to be considered for the the plan to be successful for that 1 year or beyond.
Thank you both for answering that question. It relates to another question we had received during the registration during the registration period, which was whether you could, and if you want to add anything, how would you comment on how to properly structure a settlement plan for privately sponsored refugees? I guess it's more about the outline of it itself, like the and you already talked about the components. Do you have any other tips for properly structuring a settlement plan for privately sponsored refugees?
Yeah, so I mean, ideally what you would do is you would take each of these categories. So for example, clothing, furniture, startup costs, food stable, hookup costs, and also look into the settlement checklist, which is slightly cut off on this screen, but it's in, it's just this thing at the bottom here. So it outlines what are the exact settlement responsibilities. So maybe I can just pull it up.
Sure.
From our website, so we can look at that. So, for example, this is the Group of 5 settlement plan, and underneath the settlement needs checklist, the financial perspective, you have the settlement checklist. And again, a lot of these things tie in to what's been outlined on the financial needs checklist. So, for example, you have to arrange for transportation. You have to arrange for accommodation, applying for IFHP, etc. So all of those things that we looked at when we had those settlement responsibilities. What you would ideally do is you would take, for example, transportation. For example, you would assign a designated person from the sponsoring group to that. So for example, Christina may be responsible for transportation in our sponsoring group. And then you would outline exactly what the group is going to do to ensure that the refugee has adequate access to public transportation. So in the context of Toronto, that may take the form of showing the refugee where they can go to buy tokens so they can use the TTC, or showing the refugee where they can buy a monthly Metro pass, or how to reload their Presto card so they have access to that public transportation. In more rural areas, it may be the case that the people from the sponsoring group or volunteers would need to volunteer their time to drive and transport the refugees to doctor's appointments, dentists, grocery stores, with the eventual goal of them obtaining a driving license in Canada and helping them find a car. And similarly for accommodation, you would again have a designated person for that. So for example, I may be responsible for accommodation, and our group would detail exactly what we're going to do for accommodation. So we will house them temporarily for the first month at my apartment, because I have adequate space to house them temporarily for a month. And in that month, we will assess their needs and see where, we would ask them where would they like to settle in Toronto, for example, if that's settlement community. Would they like to settle in a certain neighborhood where they're close to people from their same community? Would they like to settle in another part of the town or the city? And that also depends on a number of things, such as needs. Like, do they have any immediate medical needs that need to be taken into consideration? So do they need close proximity to a hospital or a doctor's or a dentist? Do they also, is the accommodation also affordable? So that may dictate where we house them, and also sustainability. So can the refugees live in this property beyond the 12-month sponsorship period, taking into the fact that the refugees may transition to Ontario Works or social assistance because they may not be employed or self-employed, or the level of income they have from their employment or self-employment may not be to the same level that they're receiving from us in the 12-month sponsorship period. So what an ideal settlement plan would look like would be a really well thought out, detailed, very specific settlement plan with designated people that are going to take the lead on certain activities, with deadlines for when things ideally would need to be done, but also with built-in flexibility, taking into account that things may not always go to plan. There may be things that may come up unexpectedly when you're trying to implement the settlement plan. So that's what we would really, well, in all of our trainings, that's what we really say. You need to provide lots of information, very specific, detailed, in order to satisfy IRCC that you do have an adequate settlement plan and you do have the settlement capacity to fulfill your responsibilities.
Thank you. So I see we still have some time. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to ask them. I'm just going to take two more that I see here from our registration forms. One is, do settlement workers help sponsors complete the settlement plan? In terms of actually completing the form, I think that's the underlying question.
I think we have trainers. The first part is the RSTP have trainers to look at some of the costs and some of the. I'm hoping that we can have a sponsor sitting with us as settlement workers, so that we can look at, for example, the family, the refugee family, looking at for each member what should be the mini plans for them. For example, for seniors, what do you do? For younger persons, what will you do? So each person, the needs is a bit different. So if we can ahead of time do some planning, then it is easier for you to do the costing as well.
And just at RSTP, we can review settlement plans for sponsors or for settlement workers that are assisting sponsors with completing the settlement plan that's submitted to IRCC as part of the application pack. Myself and my colleagues at RSTP, we are able to review them for you, give you feedback on the settlement plan and all the application forms. And there's also another organization called the Refugee Sponsorship Support Program, or Refugee SSP for short. These are groups of lawyers that are located regionally across Canada, and they offer their time and services on a pro bono basis, so for free, and they will sit down with sponsoring groups and assist them with completing the application form. So whereas we at RSTP, we can only review the forms, Refugee SSP, they can assign you a lawyer, match you with a lawyer, and they can assist the sponsoring group with reviewing, going through and completing the settlement plan and all of the other forms. And all of these lawyers affiliated with Refugee SSP have been trained by RSTP, so they know how to complete all of the application forms correctly, and they know what to include in the settlement plan to make sure that it does satisfy IRCC. So those are the two options from the refugee sponsorship perspective.
Great, thank you. And do you have any pointers for those who want to involve the refugee in the, as a sort of best practice in the development of the plan? Like to have the newcomer, I guess, to be part of the planning? Like how would someone approach that?
So just from the forms that are submitted to IRCC's perspective, if sponsors are sponsoring under the private sponsorship of refugees program, they typically have a connection with the refugees they're sponsoring. So either it's friends, relatives, it may be acquaintances or people they've met over the internet, but there always is a channel of communication, generally speaking, under the PSR program between the sponsoring group and the refugees that are being sponsored. So when the sponsoring group is completing this form, or the group of five, or the community sponsor or sponsorship agreement holder settlement plan, they can really they can ask the question to the refugee before they complete this form. So they can say, here what our responsibilities are. What do you need from us? Is there anything specific that you need from us that's not captured in our responsibilities listed on this form? Do you have any special medical needs or educational needs? Do you have any specific activities that you would like to engage in Canada that may help you find a job or promote self-employment? So you can really, under the PSR program, the sponsors can really get the input of the refugees when completing this form, because typically there is that channel of communication. And if sponsors do consult the refugees, there's better opportunity, and it's more likely that the settlement plan that they submit to IRCC is specifically tailored to the refugee and the refugee family that they're sponsoring. So it's not a generic cookie cutter settlement plan is specifically tailored, detailed, structured for the refugees that are being sponsored. I'm not sure, Christina, if you have any in terms of working with sponsors and refugees.
I think the question seems to be more related to the forms, so I think you have answered it.
And Christina, in your experience, I mean, the newcomer is part of the action plan or the other planning that settlement workers do, yes? Or to what extent, I guess, are they being involved in the planning of, the next steps? Because you said you see them over not just once. You don't take care of all of their needs in one meeting.
A lot of the time, for example, the sponsor will say, okay, go to so-and-so, go to this organization, ask for this, and then get this done. So then we, for example, in relating to the child care, subsidized daycare, or looking at child tax benefit. So these are some of the things that we will involve the refugees themselves, but that is already the eye in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. We have another question from Linda. She's asking, how can we make it clear to newcomers that settlement workers cannot give advice or actually complete government forms for a client?
Some of the clients, they have English. So what we do at our center is that we do have a computer. We could print out the forms for the individual to work on the forms, and then we can look at when they have questions related to a particular question, we can explain those questions. And there are times that we may be a new form that just came out. We can also contact the IRCC with the individuals so that we can facilitate understanding of those forms. Did I answer your question?
It seems so. I don't see any follow-up questions. If there are any, okay, Linda, would you like to be? I see you have your hand up, so I'll just unmute you so you can follow up. Go ahead, Linda. So you're unmuted, but we can't hear you. So it's possible that your audio is not working, that you don't have a proper mic. If you have any other follow-up questions or comments, feel free to type them. Okay. So I don't think there are any more questions. I want to thank everyone for joining us today and joining the conversation and asking so many questions. And of course, thank you, Suneet and Christina, for your very thoughtful insights and your presentations. All of the attendees today, you'll receive a follow-up email in a couple of days' time. It will contain a link to today's recording and a link to the copy of the slides, as well as a link to an evaluation survey. We would really appreciate it if you would complete that evaluation survey to provide your feedback. It's really important to us to know how it went for you and what you thought of it, if it met your expectations, if you have any other outstanding questions that we might be able to answer. That evaluation link will also pop up when we end the webinar today. So it's not a spam or a commercial or anything. If something pops up on your desktop, it's really just a link for the evaluation. I recommend, if you do have the time, to do it now while things are fresh in your mind. But again, it will also be in the presentation, in the follow-up email, and you can, excuse me. So as I mentioned earlier, this is part of a series. We do have The next webinar is coming up on January 15th at 12:30 to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. That is a Monday as well, and it's focusing on a little bit of a background of the private sponsorship of refugees program. We already started the series with a webinar on the background of the settlement sector. So now we're switching gears a little bit in January to focus on the background of the private sponsorship refugees program and the state that it's in currently. We'll be joined by Dawn Smith of the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa, which is a sponsorship agreement holder, and Brian Dick, who's the chair of the Sponsorship Agreement Holders Council, as well as the Mennonite Central Committee. So that will be January 15th. You will see the link as I've put up here again on welcomeontario.ca. It includes a whole schedule of the upcoming webinars. You can register there. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at refugeesettlement@ocasi.org, or if it pertains to settlement plan or you want to reach out to the RSTP, Suneet had shared his and Christina's contact information as well. So on behalf of OCASI and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a wonderful day. Thank you.